Hey everyone, this is Bathmetrics, and today I am doing a follow-up to the video I posted yesterday about my clip to zero production strategy. If you haven't yet seen this video, a lot of what I'm going to say is going to go right over your head. I'm going to use terminology and concepts I already demonstrated in this one. So if you feel lost, go back and watch this, and then come and catch up with this video. All right, so I realized as I was approaching the end of that video, I didn't want to go over 2 hours because that's asking a lot. So there were a couple things I said I would circle back to at the end that I didn't. And I'm going to cover those in this video, a couple points that I wanted to get to but didn't. And then I also had a couple of my producer friends ask a couple clarifying questions about some things in the video. And based on the questions they asked me, I'm just going to reiterate a couple really basic points and try to make it a little more clear what I did. I moved pretty fast in that video because there was a lot to cover. And, some of it might not have sunk in. So before I begin, let's point out that this project is exactly where I left it. And all I've done to change anything is I've plugged in my master burn of this file into an A/B comparison tool, a referencing tool. And when this button is gold, we're hearing the original master. When this button is blue, we're hearing whatever's live in the project, because I'm going to be changing some things to show you a few tricks. And we're going to want to be able to compare it with how it originally sounded. So right now, just to show what's going on, okay, so they're both hitting at the same integrated loudness, bouncing around between 7.5, 7.4, 7.3, depending on how long we let it run. And they're exactly the same right now. So we'll get back to this later. I just wanted to show you this was lined up and ready to go. So the first thing I want to really make clear and really reiterate is that the core of this process, the whole clip to zero, the reason it's called clip to zero is because it's about every step of the way from the very beginning of your project. You're trying to find the loudest pre-fader potential of any given sound you're going to pull into the project. And the reason you're doing that is to figure out whether or not that sound will still sound good and survive any kind of, squash or push you have to make on that sound to make it hit your target loudness, okay? So if you work at lower target loudnesses, it's less of an issue. But if you work in the more competitive loudness genres, like, bass music and stuff like that, a lot of sounds won't survive the push to loudness. And you don't find that out until you've spent hours, days, weeks on your original arrangement and composition and mixing. And then you get to the mastering stage and try and push everything up. And you find that certain sounds don't survive that push. And then you're like, crap. And you're either slapping Band-Aids on that sound to fix it, or you're replacing them with other sounds that'll behave better in the mix. And it's a big mess. It's a big knot to untangle at the end. And I got really tired of doing that. And that's why I kept looking for a better way, a more predictable way to work. So if you can find for every sound the highest, loudest point it can get to without falling apart or starting to sound different or bad, and then you set that as the basic gain into a channel. Now you basically say at zero fader, my sound is at its loudest potential. And if I drop the fader, of course I can make that sound quieter. But anytime I need to make sure it's pushed up into the mix where it needs to be, I'm confident I'm not going to get to zero and find that it's still too weak, right? And I can always hear this sound at effectively its most crushed, right? Its lowest dynamic range. I can hear how it sounds in the context of an entire mix that's operating at its lowest dynamic range. And so everything's much more predictable. And if a sound's not going to work, you discover it super fast. And you can throw it away and try a different sound, or you can try some quick and dirty processing fixes to see if you can make that sound work, right? So it's all about finding that loudest potential. And then, once you've set it so that coming into the track, it's at its loudest potential, pre-fader, Then you just adjust your fader up and down to balance that sound into your mix, to level it where it needs to sit in the mix, right? So that's the basic idea. And let's just show you this process a few times on a few more sounds. I demonstrated it on the kick and the snare and on this bass sample that's in audio 4 here. But let's just do it a couple more times. And I was only showing it to you on certain kinds of sounds and not like synth patches and stuff. So let's see what that looks like. Let's start with another sample. I'm just going to create another audio track. I'm going to solo that audio track so we're not, confused by anything else out there. And let's just go find a basic sample. Like I searched for ARPs, pick any one of these. Okay, so stop it. So these two samples, these two ARPs are very different. One's much quieter than the other. So let's play with these two. We're going to pick this quieter one first. All right, and I'm going to just do this all in the clip launcher. So that's this audio 5 here. Drag this over. Let's see, it's 140 BPM. My project's at 90. So let's say this was 70 BPM. We'll just cut it in half like I did yesterday. Change this to elastic. Original tempo of 70. We'll loop it. We'll make it 2 bars long, maybe, yeah, 2 bars long. Okay, so now it should fit the project tempo. Doesn't matter really because we're not going to listen to it in context with everything else, but here's what it sounds like now. Haha, nice and fast. Let's go ahead and slow it down. Let's put this back at 140 and see what happens. And let's go ahead and also blow it back out to a length of 4. Okay. Yeah, see, it's not really the right ARP for this song. Let's just keep it raw. We'll just keep it raw and not change its tempo at all. Because we're just going to listen to it by itself. Okay, so I have a sample. First thing I do is, I've got all these gain 0 things all over my project. So usually I would just click one and copy and drag it over, right? But if you're doing it from scratch, again, I recommend using DP Meter 4, right? It's got several modes. It's got an RMS mode. It's got a LUFS mode or EBU mode here. I use RMS for this clip to 0 thing. And a couple things, if you use this plugin, by default, the RMS window is 600 milliseconds, which is ridiculously long. Most RMS meters use a 300 millisecond window. So the first thing I did when I got this plugin was I set the RMS window to 300. And then I also set the reference level to 0. And then, at least in Bitwig, you can right click on this and say, save it as the default preset. And so then every time I bring it in, it's just ready to use for this purpose. And I just rename it, gain 0 over here. But I'm not going to bother for the rest of these demonstrations. The point is they're all over my project. They're ready to go. They look exactly like this. So the basic idea, here's my audio track. It's got the ARP in it. And we're just going to run it for a second and measure the peak, right? So this thing's already peaking at 0. So we don't have to change a thing, right? So we leave it just like this. Now, once it's peaking at 0, the next thing we do is bring in a hard clipper. Again, I would just normally grab a hard clipper from somewhere else and copy it over. And then if I copied it from somewhere else, I'll open it and make sure it's neutral. Like right now, it's gaining 6.6 dB up into the ceiling. So it's clipping 6.6 dB. And it's clipping by pushing the signal up into the ceiling, which is 0. Because by the time the signal runs through this and gets to here, it's 0. It's at the ceiling of 0 dB full scale, right? And so any gain I push into it is effectively going to push those peaks past the ceiling, right? Like if I play it right now with this much gain, you can see those gray bars up here. Those are the peaks being shaved off because it's being pushed into the ceiling. But these two lines represent 0, full scale, okay? Now, another way you can use a clipper is you can clip the ceiling. You can pull the ceiling down into the signal, right? So that's another way to clip. Like that. And then if you want to actually see the clipping, you can blow it up. See, now it's clipping that way, but this isn't how you want to do it, okay? I want to make that really clear because some clippers only work by basically pulling the ceiling down onto something. You pull the ceiling into the signal, and then you use some makeup gain or something to push that new clip signal upwards back where you want it. Some of them only work like that. This is why I like G-clip, because you got this visual thing to tell you what's going on and let you see that you're shaving clips. And it also gives you the choice of either pulling the ceiling down into the signal or pushing the signal up into the ceiling, right? So this is how we use it in my method. You always set your ceiling at 0 and then clip up into the ceiling until you find that breaking point, and then you pull it back from that breaking point. So let's see where the breaking point is for this sound. Okay, clearly at 8 dB of clipping, this sound is starting to fall apart and get a little bit too broken up, right? But almost any point before this, it's a matter of taste. What is your taste? How saturated and clipped and distorted do you want this to be? You could even choose to dial in a soft clipping curve if you want, but I typically recommend just sticking with hard clipping. You can find your own personal preferences there, but start with hard clipping and then maybe try softening it up a little bit and see if you like that sound better. But the idea is somehow drive it up into that ceiling of 0, clip to 0, okay? So. Okay, if my target level for this song was a loud, competitive, like, bass music type of song, I might want an aggressive sounding clip like this. I might want it this hot, right? By clipping it by a full 4.6 dB up into the ceiling. And I'm evening out the dynamic range. Instead of a big wide caterpillar thing with huge spines, it's now a little bit more sausage shaped. But you can see it still has some variation inside there, right? So again, at this point, it's a matter of taste. It's also kind of a matter of, if you know you're working in loud genres, you probably want hotter, more dense sounds with less delicate peaks sticking out either side, but it's a matter of taste. The point is, set it at 0, then clip into that ceiling of 0, clip to 0. Okay, so I'm going to leave this sound like this, and we'll say that one's done. And then at that point, if at this setting, this sound is too loud for the whole mix, I just pull it down. What I typically do after setting it to clip to 0 is I just drag the fader all the way down, and then I play my mix without this being soloed, and it won't sound good because it's a different tempo and everything, so I'm not going to do it for you. But I would just unsolo the sound, play the whole thing, and just drag the fader up, find that sweet spot where it sounds like it's sitting in the mix well, and then I leave it alone, right? Maybe later as the mix grows and gets even more dense, I'll adjust some of these faders, but it's always working at the loudest potential I set with the clip to 0 mechanic. That's the whole heart of this entire strategy, okay? So let's do it on another sound. I'll just delete that. No, yeah, I'll just delete it. Okay, so let's try a synthesizer patch, because that can be a little more confusing because of the way synths work. Where is my serum stuff? Oh, did I delete it? Let's do a couple things. I'm going to do undo. No. Where did it go? Sorry, I'm just doing undos until I get my things back that were here. Well, that's no fun. All right, let's make sure I didn't undo any of this. Okay, those are still there. All right, well, heck, we'll just make it from scratch again. So here in this, I did have a synth all lined up. Should still have my chords patch, yeah. So I've got a little chords MIDI. Stop that. I've got a little chords MIDI. And it's not playing anything right now because there's no synth on this patch. So let's just drop it back in again. Serum. Oh, let's go find some chords. What future bass? What looks good? Let's try. Wash away. Stop that. Ah, because I've clicked buttons over in my metric AB and left it on the orange button. Got to make sure we're listening to the project for this. Okay. So there we go. So we have a serum thing. It's just an RP patch. I'm sorry, it's a chord patch. And you can see it's already blowing over 0 at its default, master setting and all the internal settings. So let's fix it. I'm just going to grab a gain to 0 from somewhere else, drag it over here, copy it over here. All right. Now open it up and reset it because it's got whatever setting was on the other track I copied it from. So cool thing about this plugin is if you just hold down Alt and click the gain, you reset everything. And now there's no gain. It's completely neutral. So now we're just going to run it for a little bit and see how loud this measures it. Okay, so we'll pick that. And then we click this button. It reduces the gain by 3.4. And now here's the thing that might confuse you. When we play this again, it might not hit exactly 0. And that's because synth patches can be really unpredictable because of some of the stuff built into them. Modulations. A modulator might start at a different point and change things in a different way. And so synth patches, you're unlike a sample, you're not always going to get it exactly at 0. You're just going to get close to 0, and there might be a little wiggle room on either side, and that's okay. And you can adjust this manually if you want by a couple decimal points. Okay, so let's see what happens with this, and let's also drop a oscilloscope here, so you can kind of see what the signal looks like. And I should have copied it oscilloscope over because I always have to change these values a little bit. Okay, so you can see that it's not exactly peaking at 0. Like I didn't play it long enough to catch this even louder spike right here. So, okay, if you want to really kind of iterate on it and you want to fix it, you can see it's already at negative 3.4. It's measuring that I'm still at one point I went over peak by 0.6. So if I click this one more time, it now sets this to 4.0. See how easy that is? That's why I love this plugin. It's just like, okay, well, for whatever reason it didn't get close the first time, I can just iterate by, if it comes up with a new measurement, just click that button one more time and automatically does that kind of math calculation for you, right? So we're just going to ignore this now. It's close enough to 0. It doesn't have to be perfect, just near 0, right? And we can see that this waveform's a little spiky like a caterpillar. There's definitely some spikes here that could probably be cut off. So let's go ahead and, again, bring in the hard clipper. Right here, we'll just copy this one over from Audio 4. And again, I need to look at it and make it neutral, because right now it's pushing 6.6 dB up into the ceiling. So to make it neutral, I just drag it back down, right? Now it's neutral. Now, maybe I'll make this a little smaller, and we'll take a look at the waveform, and we'll drive the gain up into the ceiling. Clip up into 0. We set it at 0 here. And then now we're going, and let's put the oscilloscope after so you don't get confused. Signal comes in, we set it to 0, and then we clip back up into 0. Okay, sounds exactly the same so far. Let's clip even further. Right? To me, that still sounds the same. Let's double check. Remember, I showed you this trick in the other video. If you really want to double check and make sure you're not overcooking the sound too much, and you want to hear it against the original, when you're messing with clippers and gain and RMS and all that stuff, dynamic range, it's really hard to compare the two sounds side by side. Like if I just turn off the clipper and then turn it on, do they really sound the same? Have I really harmed the sound? Because louder always sounds better to your brain. So you think that's better, but is it? Is it really better? Let's find out for sure. Let's put ABLM on here, just like I showed you in the last video. So we'll put the first one on, get rid of it, put the second one on. Move that over to the side where we can get to it, and then we're going to bracket the hard clip with this. So the first one is listening to the signal before it hits the clipper. And then the second one is listening to the internal signal from the clipper, and it's balancing the loudness dynamically as we go. So let's run it for a second. And as you can hear, when I toggle, the signal without the hard clipper against the signal that has the hard clipper, automatically gain matched to the same volume, and I can just A/B it this way, it sounds identical, right? So clearly, it's perfectly safe to take this lovely synth, which has all these delicate transients on it, and crush it. Go ahead, crush it, clip it. It sounds the same. You can't hear the distortion. There's so many frequencies in this thing that the harmonics and the distortion and any kind of, stuff that the clipper's doing to it is still really transparent, because it's, again, hard clipping especially is almost identical to what a limiter does. It's very transparent unless you overdo it. Okay, so I've found a spot where I might even be able to push it more, but I'm just going to stop here because it makes the point. You set the ceiling to 0 on the original signal, and then you take a neutral limiter that's set at the ceiling of 0, and then you push the signal up into the ceiling, okay, until to your ears it sounds good. Typically, if you're going to work in louder genres, you're going to want a slightly hotter sound, or it's just going to fall up, it's just going to fade into the background of the mix, right? So you might push more to taste for loud genres, and you might clip less to taste, or you might not clip at all. There's no reason you have to clip. That's up to you, and a lot of it's up to your intended, desired target loudness for the song you're building. And that's what we're going to get to next. So I just wanted to show you a couple times on a couple more sounds how to do the clip to 0 and why to do it. You're finding that maximum loudness where it's still clean. And then if this sound is too loud in the drop at this, nice hot loudness, I simply pull the fader down and push it back up until it's sitting exactly where I want it in the mix. And then you don't care if this is below 0 because it will be, right? But that might be the perfect level for the mix. Doesn't matter what this says because I set it to 0 here and then I clipped up into that ceiling, clipped to 0. It's all pre-fader. Then you bring in the fader and balance it in your mix, okay? There's the basic idea. So let's get rid of this stuff and go on to the next thing. I'm just gonna kill you entirely. And we should be back to our original mix now. Okay, so the next thing that's really, really easy to apply and understand, but I'm sorry I didn't get to it in the last video. It was something I was going to cover at the end. I told you in that video at the very beginning, you can use this technique for any type of song in any genre at any loudness, okay? Doesn't matter if you're producing at -14 LUFS straight to Spotify because for some reason you want to make use of all that dynamic range. It doesn't matter if you're doing bass music and you're trying to hit -7 LUFS or louder and just be really intense and loud, right? It doesn't matter. This works for all of those approaches. And I'm going to show you how right now. So the entire trick to quickly setting the target loudness you want at the very beginning of the project when you're first setting up your framework sounds. And remember, the framework sounds in this example, in a bass music sense, is usually just your kick and your snare. So these two things were set to clip to 0 at the point where they were at their maximum loudness potential, okay? And then once those were set, and you'll notice that since they're the anchor sounds or the framework sounds for the entire mix, those faders stay right at 0, right? Maximum loudness potential, faders at 0, and that's effectively the top loudest amount that this thing can ever be pushed into a limiter. Maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room there, right? But it's basically really close to your target loudness, okay? And so then we went and added this bass chop, which is just simulating a little group of about 4 different bass sounds, playing a typical mid-bass drop. Right? Nice and heavy. And so what if I wanted to use these sounds and I wanted to make a bass music tune, but I didn't necessarily want to shoot all the way for -7? What for whatever reason I wanted to make this song a little bit quieter and I wanted to produce a little less hot, a little less intense, and I would be okay with a LUFS of about -10 on the drops instead of -7. So how would you set that up from the very, very beginning and just set that target up and then work at that target the whole time? It's really, really, really simple. I'm going to take the drop sounds out of the equation. I'm just going to mute the drop sounds group. So now we're just at the drums. I'm also going to turn off the mastering compressor and the limiter over here so that we're just hearing only the drums clipped to 0. And we're going to see what they measure at over here in the LUFS. Okay, so I've got another instance at the very end of my master track. After everything else, I have one instance of this same DP meter 4, but this one's in EBU mode, right? So it's measuring all the LUFS numbers we typically care about. So let's reset it and see right now with these kick and snare set at the original clip to 0, where I clipped both of them about 2 dBs into the 0 ceiling to get them a little bit hotter. Let's see what that measures just in terms of raw LUFS, just those two sounds. Okay, that doesn't look very exciting, does it? Momentary loudness of 12.2. Well, that's because I took out the bass track, right? And remember, whenever you sum things together, when you sum several sounds together, the peaks keep growing, and they grow in really weird, almost exponential ways sometimes. So When I first set up these drums, they were much louder. But then when I introduced the bass chops and summed them with the drums, and they came together and summed here on this instrumental bus, my peak was suddenly way the hell over zero. And so I had to use the peak to zero technique to actually drop the gain by -6. So again, here's the clue. If I turn on my drop sounds again, come here, get out of the way. If I take this group and unmute it, and we look at this LUFS measurement over on the master at the very end, and we also look at the instrumental bus right here and look at its peak meter. So we can see we're hitting momentary peaks of 7 LUFS on the master. We can see the instrument bus is right at 0 because it was set to 0 and then clipped into 0, right? With the total combination of all the sounds that we're summing into the bus. All right, don't worry about this integrated loudness. I'm going to explain that in a later section, right? So if we're going to turn something off and kind of like pretend we're starting from scratch again, right? So I'm going to hide my drop sounds bus again and just collapse this up. So as soon as I do that, you're going to see that this bus drops down to 5.1, negative 5.1. So what I need to do is go back to my gain 0, right? And reset this so that it's back to 0 again. So how do I do that? Well, probably the easiest way is just to clear it out to 0, remeasure it. And as you can see, it's already at 0 because these drum sounds were already clipped to 0. They were already clipped to 0. So they come up and they roll up towards this instrument bus and nothing needs to change. And it just stays 0 all the way up towards the pre-master, all the way up. All these numbers are 0, okay? So now that I'm actually hearing the kick and the snare at their full potential loudness, remember that one of the things I did was to clip them. Okay, so I've got these hard clippers on, and each one of them is being clipped by 2 dB pushed into the ceiling of 0. So when I have those two sounds by themselves running, at 0 all the way up to the pre-master and then rolling over to the master, and the master is also hitting 0. Let's see what the actual LUFS values are now. What we're looking for is the momentary max. That's our clue for how loud this song can potentially be with the kick and the snare set up at their loudest potential. Okay, so we're watching the momentary max. See that? Negative 6.6 LUFS is potentially how loud we can drive this song by the time the mix is done. So right off the bat, as soon as you drop in your first anchor sounds, your framework sounds, your kick and your snare, maybe your vocals, or depending on your genre, other things might be the important framework, but there's always that loudest sound that's in every mix. In bass music, electronic dance music, it's the kick and the snare, or at the very least the kick. Some genres don't really use a snare, or it's just a little kind of quiet thing around the kick, right? So whatever your anchor sound is, you clip it to 0, you measure the momentary max. When everything from that point is running at 0 all the way up through the master, you just measure the momentary max over here. And that's your potential loudness. Everything else can be mixed right up into that loudness if you want to push it that hard, okay? Now, what if I don't want to work with this kick and snare this hot? What if I don't want to clip them at all and I want them to have a little more breathing room, a little more pokiness, a little more of that transient instead of crushing the transient right from the get-go? We figured out in the last video that we could crush each one of them by as much as 2 dB up into the ceiling, and they still sounded effectively the same. But just for grins, let's just turn off these clippers. I'm just going to turn them off. So we're no longer crushing down by 2 dB and therefore raising the RMS 2 dB. They're now going to be a little bit less hot. They're still going to hit 0 because, you know, we started the gain at 0, the peaks touching 0, and then we drove a clipper 2 dB up of those peaks into the ceiling at 0. But now we got rid of that clipping. So they're still touching 0, they're just not clipping anymore. So what does this momentary max look like now? And I feel like I'm missing something because it should be a little lower. Oh, I need to reset it. Sometimes it doesn't reset correctly unless it's running when you click reset. This wasn't my expected outcome. Oh, there it is. I turned off the wrong thing. See, I was looking at the wrong... I get a little confused because I often don't use all 4 kicks and snares. My bad. Let's turn off that kick hard clipper. There we go. These are the 2 that need to be off. Now the outcome's going to be what I expect. There we go. Okay, so you can see now that when we take the clippers off of the kick and snare and we let them touch 0 with their original waveform, but not clip it any further, now our momentary loudness, after everything rolls up at 0 peak, all the way over to the master, still at 0, and we measure the loudness, it's now negative 7.4. Turn these clippers on again, and it's going to change back to negative 6 point whatever. Turn them off. Make sure it's the right ones this time. Okay, see how that works? So the point is this. Whatever kick you bring in, whatever snare you bring in, whatever anchor sounds you bring in, your vocals, if you've got some vocal acapellas or shots or whatever, or a recorded vocal track, you're going to want to, you know, probably limit and process those vocals a lot, get them close to where you want them, right? And then you're going to clip them to 0. You're going to gain them up to 0, and then you're going to probably push them into a clipper. Now, I tend to use soft clippers on vocals, but that's, again, you could use a hard clipper. But you're going to find that spot where the vocals are just like right at their hottest and loudest they could be before they start sounding bad. And then you're going to pull back a little from that. And then if you have vocals plus a kick and a snare, all those things are going to be summing together over here on the pre-master. And so you'd be like, you know, making sure the pre-master is hitting the ceiling at 0. Then you'll decide if you want to clip a little more on the pre-master. And, you know, eventually you get over here. And by the time you put in your kick, your snare, and your vocals, or if it's an instrumental track and you don't have vocals, just your kick and your snare, taking a simple, quick measurement right here and looking at the momentary, that's going to tell you right out of the gate, how loud can I make this song? If I don't clip this kick and this snare, the loudest I'm going to be able to make this song is 7.4, more or less, right? So this is your rough ballpark number, momentary loudness max. Set your anchors, measure momentary loudness over at the master, make sure everything's running at 0 all the way up to the master. And that number is your magic number, right? So these are already pretty aggressive kicks and snares. I could get as loud as 7.4, but if for some reason I wanted to, you know, only master up to like negative 10 LUFS, well, that could be easy enough. I could simply take my kick and snare bus fader down, right, in the total mix. If I find that mixing with these set at 0 on their summing bus, if that ends up making a master that's too loud, I can just take this fader down by like, you know, 2 dB and every other bus fader that's summing with it by the same amount. And I basically just drop my whole master. So you can play with that if you want. So I guess that's the main point I want to make is If you want to work at a certain target, bring in your anchor sounds, set the clip to 0, check the momentary max. If it's too high or too low, think about your anchor sounds. Maybe they need to be different. Maybe you need to clip them more. Maybe you need to clip them less. Maybe you need to do a combination of clipping and some other sort of aggressive process that increases the RMS higher than it increases the peaks, like adding saturation or drum bus or a variety of tools or upward compression or parallel compression or parallel saturation, or just there's so many tricks for increasing RMS. You can apply any combination of RMS and or clip to effectively push that RMS even closer up to 0. And all you're doing the whole time is looking at this final little meter way at the end of your master and double checking what that momentary max value is going to end up being. Make it louder, make it softer by playing with this stuff. Keep it at 0 going into the stuff, but then either clip up into 0 or add saturation or both until you get the value you want here. And it still sounds good. These still sound clean and they have the right amount of punch or whatever you're looking for. Okay. And then you've got your anchor around which to test every other sound you bring into the project. You bring it in, you clip to 0, you see how it compares against these. Does it sound right? Can you level it at a good level against those anchor sounds? And as your whole mix is building up, you're just effectively working at this LUFS the entire time. So that brings me to, let's skip a little bit in my notes. How do you make it so that this project is actually playing at an integrated loudness that matches my momentary loudness? How does that work? Okay, so let's get back to where we were. We had some anchor sounds, and we're going to start with just the anchor sounds. And we know that their potential is negative 7.4 LUFS. Actually, let me clip these up again. Let's just turn on those clippers again. And now we know that our potential is as high as negative 6.6 LUFS, but I don't want to go that high. I want to stop at 7. Okay, so what I'm going to do is leave this meter open, and I'm going to follow the breadcrumb trail upward from my kick to my kick snare group. I'm not doing any additional processing here. It's still peaking at 0. I'm not clipping it here. There's no need to because I'm not yet summing my drum tops with my kick and snare. What I'm going to do instead is just keep walking up my cascade until I get all the way to the final thing before the master, which in my case, I have a pre-master bus. And this is where you control the actual project loudness that you hear the whole time you're working without having to engage your mastering compressor and mastering limiter. I'm going to keep these off until the end. I want to do rough, quick, and dirty limiting. I want to do dirty limiting the whole way up. And I want to hear this project at my target loudness with dirty limiting. The reason I want dirty limiting is these things, real limiters and real mastering compressors, keep applying latency. And they also use a lot of CPU. So really, I wouldn't just turn these off. While I'm working for most of my project, I would literally deactivate these so that they're not adding any latency to the project, and they're also not impacting my CPU at all. They're not doing any kind of CPU hit because they're just gone. At least that's the way it works in Bitwig. If you deactivate something, it's gone. Okay, so I would normally work like this. I would set my kick and snare, find their maximum potential loudness with the clip to 0 method, and then I walk all the way up to the topmost bus before my master, okay? The last summing point before the master, and that's the pre-master here. So then I simply make sure the peaks are touching 0, and then I clip. This is my quick and dirty limiter for the entire project. I'm now just going to push my entire sum signal for this project on the pre-master up into 0 on the pre-master until I see the integrated loudness I want. Let's hear what happens. Let's try about that. You can hear that the kick and the snare by themselves right now, the way they're sitting in the mix, you can hear that they're being affected. The kick is starting to round out and be a little less pokey, but there's, when you're squeezing into a tight dynamic range for a harder loudness target, there are compromises. You can't keep sounds perfect. I mean, that's the whole trade-off. You're getting hotter, more dense sounds in order to get that brighter, hot, dense mix, but some sounds are going to suffer, and it's just a matter of balancing how much you end up suffering versus that kind of overall hotness and density you want. So I've gained up the kick and the snare right now by 2 into the ceiling up here on the pre-master. What are we at now? Okay, so now I'm hitting like negative 7.9. And let's go for 7. Let's see how bad it sounds. Okay, let's reset this so we get it clean, because this is constantly averaging everything. Okay, so we're hitting about 7.5. Let's kick this up one more notch. Let's just do it with numbers. Let's go 2.9. Okay, so because we have a kick and a snare with huge gaps in between them, it's not really the world's most accurate integrated loudness measurement because there's so much silence in between each kick. So this is actually going to get louder when I add my first set of when I start filling out this mix. But you can see I can push myself with a dirty limiter very close to wherever my target loudness range is. And I just know from experience, if I'm hitting around 7.5 here, by the time I add other things, I'm going to go past 7. And eventually I'm going to start dragging this crush down here. I'm going to make this dirty limiter limitless because the density is going to be building up as I add more sounds to the project. But the point is, even at let's do 2.8. Even at 2.8, it doesn't sound that much different. Let's turn the hard clipper off. Right? The kick sounds starting to sound a little rubbery, but again, that kind of stuff happens. And once we use a real mastering limiter to do this and some final clip shaping on the mastering compressor, like I showed you yesterday in the other video, that roundness will be a lot less because hard clippers, especially if you're driving subby, boomy, kicky sounds into them, they do tend to distort a little quicker and faster than a compressor if you overdo it. Just a little bit actually adds punch, but too much and you start getting that rubbery, bouncy, boomy, tubby sound to the kick. Okay, but we're going to leave it like this for now. Now let's pretend we've, because we're just more or less working at this, and we've got the kick to, it's bearable. We know we're going to be backing this off. We know it's not going to be as strong later, but we're working at an integrated loudness that's close to our target. And we're working with dirty limiting. This is a dirty limiter on the very last summing point before the master so that I can work without these heavy plugins always on, okay? So now, let's keep these open and let's bring our bass sounds back in. And let's watch what happens to these numbers now. Okay, you see, we've suddenly added a whole bunch of sounds. Now we have to fix it in 2 places, right? Because we've added these drop sounds, which go to the synths. The synths eventually sum with the drums on the instrument bus right here. So we need to go to the instrument bus And we need to reset the clip to 0 here, because if we look at the gain, we're way over peak. We're 6 dB over peak now that we've added more things summing. So again, as I mentioned in the last process, as you add more sounds, you're periodically going to check your things up the bus cascade, the summing cascade, and you're going to readjust your clip to 0. So all we got to do here, it's over 6. I tap this button. Now we've gained it back down -6. And this clipper should be a lot more rational now. And we can even check that clipper and see how much it's clipping. Right, this is where we set it at the end of the last project, just a tiny, tiny bit of clipping here on this bus. And you'll notice everything sounds kind of good now. So if we go back to this clipper and this meter here, and we double check the gain on this one. Yeah, the gain here is still good. So because this bus is shaving it back down to 0 and then clipping into 0 slightly, it's still 0 by the time it comes out the bottom side. So when it rolls up to this bus, since we don't have any more things we're summing with it, there's no vocals, it's basically, this isn't being summed with anything. So this is already at 0 when it comes into the channel, right here, okay? So now we look at the clipper and we look at the final, now that these sounds are summed together and the whole mix is denser and more louder and there's not as much silence and gaps, we can see that our integrated loudness jumped up above 7, right? So let's see what happens. Let's double check this. So right now, I'm running really loud, louder than my target. So what do? I come over here on the pre-master where I have my dirty limiter, just a simple hard clipper, and I just drag the gain down a little bit. Let's see what it looks like now. So it looks like if I were to set this at about 2.2. And now I'm hitting 7 LUFS. I'm hearing my project at my target loudness. I'm hearing how every sound interacts with every other sound. All I'm doing is pushing a button or two on a thing to just make sure I'm always starting at 0. And then maybe I'm adjusting a few clipper things on the higher level buses, which are effectively acting as my dirty limiter. And my whole project's already at the mastered volume. And I can hear every new sound I keep adding in this framework. Now, as I add more sounds and subs and more synths and more basses and interjections and atmospheres and FX, what you're going to find is eventually you keep dragging this one downward, this clipper on the pre-master, it's going to be all the way down at 0 again. And you're still going to be clipping into its ceiling because you've added so much density here, right? And you might find that your song ends up being, even louder than your original target, but it still sounds good. Or you can do the next thing. So this is the other thing that some of you might struggle with, right? Let's say you overshoot at first and you make your first anchor sounds, your kick and your snare, louder than they need to be to actually hit a target loudness like -7, right? Let's say for whatever reason, by the time this full mix was built up and I finished out the project, let's say it's hitting at -6.5. Based on the way I started this when I thought I was basically getting close to a target of -7, right? And as I kept going and adding more sounds, I keep dragging this thing down and it's eventually at 0, so it's not doing any limiting at all. But everything's summing up and clipping on the way up, and it's clipping a little bit more here past 0. And now my integrated loudness on the master, without even engaging a clipper or mastering, I'm sorry, a limiter or mastering compressor on the final bus, it's over my target. So what do? Let's say I'm hitting -6.5. Well, you got two choices. You can say, I guess this song's just loud, right? It sounds good. I don't have any problem with it. And you could just say, hey, I finally went over -7, and this song is just the way it's composed and the sounds in it and the way it's sequenced and checkerboarded. It's just a loud fucking song. Okay, that's cool. That's easy. Great. If, however, for some reason you said, yeah, it's -6.5, but I feel like this whole thing just got a little too hot and dense. It's too hot. It's too dense, even for me. And so what happens if I want to back it down to -7 or -8? Or just, for whatever reason, it's too hot. I want to take all the hotness down. Okay. Well, that's an somewhat easy use case. Now we're starting to get a little complex, but there's an easy way to do this, and there's a more complex way to do this. The easy way is to, again, think about your framework sounds. If I have my framework sounds, my kick and my snare, if I'm doing something to artificially raise their RMS and reduce their peaks, if I'm trying to artificially find that loudest potential before they start falling apart, and I did in fact clip them a little bit and or saturated them a little bit somehow, made them more aggressive. The way to get your whole mix back down and relax it without tearing your hair out and going crazy and all your careful balancing to that point falling apart, it's easy. It's super easy because it all revolves around these anchor sounds, okay, these framework sounds. So in this case, it's my kick and my snare. The first thing I could do, for example, is say, well, by default, I pushed them up to 0, and then I took both of them and I clipped them above 0, right? I clipped each one of these 2 dBs above 0. So the first thing I want to do is just relax these and take all that clipping away, right? I'm just going to relax them a little bit. And remember when we did this earlier, you saw that the maximum potential over here on the master dropped from -6.6 to -8 point something, right? So just taking off the heat, the squash that you applied to the anchor sounds, the kick and the snare, and I always do this, I get the wrong one. Just by taking these 2 clippers off, we've suddenly made the anchor, the framework for the entire mix, a little bit softer. We've relaxed it. We've let the dynamic range expand back out to its full width, its natural width from that sample, from RMS to the original peak. We're not clipping those peaks anymore. So there's no point in going any softer than that. If we take away any extra RMS we put on it with saturation or whatever, and if we take away any clipping we might have done to it as well, we've effectively put the sound back to just 0, but no clip into 0, right? No crush into 0. It's just back at 0. And there's no point in ever going any softer than that. There just isn't. Why give yourself headroom above the peak of the sound? There's no point to that, especially since it's your important anchor sound. So all we want to do is leave them sitting at 0, but not driven further and harder into 0, okay? So when we relax those, the whole trick here is to compare a certain measurement over on the master bus before we relax them and after we relax them. And there's a magic number. It's the simplest thing in the world. It took me a long time to really figure this out, but it's so incredibly simple. So again, we're going to go back to our trusty meter over here on the master bus. And here's the trick. We're not going to look at LUFS anymore because LUFS is a tricky, tricky beast. It measures loudness in a psychoacoustic way that factors in a whole bunch of things like how much silence there is and where in the spectrum things are being excited. And it tries to imitate how humans hear loudness. But for this trick, for relaxing things and then rebalancing your entire mix around the new relaxed anchors, the new relaxed framework sounds, we're going to use the RMS mode because it's actually an RMS measurement that's much, much, much more useful for this. Specifically, we're going to look at this measurement that's the maximum RMS value you manage to hit. In this particular plugin, it's called RMS Momentary Max right here. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to turn those clippers back on, keep it its original hot volume, and we're just going to look at the momentary max. Okay, so it's never getting any higher than 3.4 RMS. Let's check one more time. And actually, you know what? Now that I think about it, I did steer you down a slightly wrong path. We don't want to do this on the final master bus because that RMS is also including all the other sounds from all the other buses. What we're doing is we're adjusting the framework sounds. We're relaxing them. So my bad. Let's back up a little bit. We want to follow the bus cascade, the summing cascade upward to the bus that holds the framework sounds. Okay, this is one of the reasons I separate my kick and my snare from all my drum tops, my cymbals and my claps, and I'm sorry, my cymbals and hats and shakers and all that other stuff, right? They're separate because I want to be able to treat these like anchor sounds and adjust them up or down as I need to like hit my targets. So what we're going to do is we're going to relax the sounds in this bus, the anchor sounds. And so we're going to find the bus that holds the anchor sounds. This is kind of an empty bus. Pretend it's not there. It doesn't matter for this. So we come up to the bus that holds the kick and the snare. And we're going to add that DP4 meter here. And it's already in RMS mode. And this is where we want to measure it at the end of the kick and the snare bus, the very end. All right, so now we're going to measure the momentary max. Okay, kick and snare together combined to a momentary RMS max, max RMS is the way I like to think of it, or RMS max, of negative 4.5. So let's take those clippers off. We're going to relax them, make them a little more their fullest potential dynamic range. And again, let's make sure I'm doing the right ones. I always get confused by that. Okay, kick and snare are now clippers off. What we're going to do is subtract the new number from this number. Reset it. Okay, so we went from negative 4.5 max RMS to negative 6.3 on our framework sounds. That's a difference of 1.8. Okay, so we dropped the RMS by 1.8, the maximum RMS, the peak RMS, okay, if you will. That sounds a little odd. So 1.8. And what we need to do is take every other fader in the project that sums with this kick and snare group, every other thing that is mixed based on this anchor point, and we need to drop every other bus fader in the project that has sounds on it by 1.8, okay? The difference between the RMS max before we relaxed the anchor sounds, the framework sounds, and after we relaxed the framework sounds. It doesn't matter how you relax them. You can't just pull see those clippers were clipping 2 dB each, but the difference here isn't 2 dB, it's only 1.8 RMS. See how that works? And if you use saturators, it gets even harder to figure out how much it actually changed. This is the value that tells you how much the total loudness of your framework sounds changed, that peak loudness that they're hitting. So now that I know my magic number is 1.8, 6.3 minus 4.5 is 1.8. So all I would have to do is find every other sound in every other bus that's somehow being summed with the kick and the snare, the anchor sounds. So if my drum tops are running, I'm going to take them down by 1.8. My subs, I'm going to take them down from wherever they were. So it was at negative 6, and now it's going to be negative 7.8. My synths, where that bass loop is happening, right? I could come in here and take all of these down, but that's not the way to do it. You just take the highest level thing that sums with the anchor sounds, right? So these are at the same level as the kick and snare. That's why I had to drop the drum tops by 1.8. The subs were already at -6. They're clearly summing with the kick and snare and the whole drum bus. So I took it down from -6 to -7.8. My synths are at 0. I'm going to take them down to -1.8. Okay. And then everything's summing together at the instrument bus, so there's nothing else to change. Well, let me think about that. Yeah, you would also want to take the vocals down because the vocals are going to sum with the final result on the instrument bus. So over here on vocals, I would also do -1.8. Right? Now, just by doing that, just those simple changes on the buses, not the individual tracks, I've brought all the other buses that somehow sum with my kick and snare bus by the same amount that the max RMS on my kick and snare bus changed by relaxing those anchor sounds and clipping them and pushing them less. And now I should have the same exact mix balance I had before, but the whole mix is now going to be a lower final integrated LUFS. So let's see how that works out. First of all, let's just double check what the new LUFS is over here on the master. Helps if I switch to the EBU mode. All right, let's try that again. Now, to your ears, it should sound the same as before, because it is. The relative balance of everything is the same as before. But we've gone from -7 LUFS to -10.7 LUFS. Just relaxing those anchor sounds by a clipping value of 2 made this much of a change in the overall LUFS, and bringing everything else down to match that RMS change on my anchor sounds. It's tricky. This is why, I'm just going to point this out, if you need to do this, you can, but it's always going to end up summing up a lot higher than you think it will. I might instead only want to relax that kick and snare by like 1 dB of clipping or half a dB of clipping. See what I'm saying? So this is why, although you can work backward and fix it and get to a more relaxed overall loudness and a wider dynamic range in your mix if you want to, it's always better to simply set everything up at the beginning with those techniques I showed you like 20 minutes ago to like set your anchor sounds and do a little test on the master to see where those anchor sounds are hitting. What's their maximum potential? And then drive up the dirty clipper on your top level bus before the master until you've got it running at the same integrated loudness level. And then that's where you're working. That's your song. You can hear what it's like the whole time you're building it. Okay, so let's prove to you that this is actually the same balance as before. We're just going to turn this off and we're going to use metric AB. And so remember, I still have this original master at -7 LUFS. I have the new mix down here on the blue, and we're going to compare the loudness of them first. So this is the louder one. We're just going to listen to the louder one, but let it measure the relative loudness and all that stuff of both of them. Okay, so the original was around 7.3, 7.4. The new one's at -10.6. Loudness range is actually less here. That's interesting. And the PLR is better. Okay, so do they actually sound the same? Did I actually match the original balance and leveling? Let's find out. I'm going to come over here to the playback. We're going to use match. And I'm going to do that by listening to the new quieter track while it matches the louder track against it. Okay, so the relative difference is roughly 3 dB, right? 7 LUFS versus 10 LUFS, roughly 3 dB. So now we're going to be able to A-B back and forth and hear them at the same loudness. And that way we can tell if the balance is truly effectively the same. See, it's the same. I didn't have to do anything complicated. I didn't have to pull all my faders back down to zero and completely re-level my mix from scratch and end up with something totally different than before. My mix is the same. The relative loudness of everything in the mix is the same. I did it by relaxing my anchor sounds, seeing what the max RMS difference of that relaxation was on the bus where those master sounds live. And then I took every other bus that gets summed with those master sounds and simply dropped it by that same amount of difference. And you end up with a perfect mix that's still balanced and leveled the same way. It's just less loud. One more time. Exactly the same. Now, what's different, and getting back to the original point of all of the videos in this series about mastering and loudness, depending on what you're listening on, how carefully you're listening. YouTube, of course, is obscuring this a little bit with its lossy compression of the audio. But what you'll notice is the original master is a little bit more intense. It's a little bit more dense. It's a little bit more hot. Yes, maybe the kick and the snare aren't quite as peaky sounding and sharp, but they're even louder in a different way, especially if I get rid of my dirty limiting, because we're listening to it all with dirty limiting on this blue version right now, right? Like this is the dirty limiting done with just a clipper over here. And this one was burned with my careful settings on the mastering compressor and the mastering limiter, which punch things up again, right? And sharpen things up again and do some nice things. And it's a little more transparent than this dirty limiting being done by the clipper on the hard master right now. So the bottom line is it's still really close. You could just like not even bother with the mastering compressor and mastering limiter and just use clippers for your entire project and put this out on SoundCloud, and nobody's going to know that you didn't even use a real mastering limiter on it. And you didn't use any kind of like compression process. And remember, this whole project, I didn't even do my normal mix bus stuff, all my normal stuff to really prettify the sound, right? This is the rawest thing possible, and it still sounds really good. Now, where you can hear the difference, that hotness that I keep talking about, why we tend to drive for -7 LUFS or louder, listen to that little vocal hey that happens right around here. Hey, listen to that. Now listen to it on the hotter version. Hear how it's more intense? It's definitely like hotter. And there's another spot over here where this big bass dive happens. Okay, that. Let's set a new cue point right about there and just focus on that. Let's go hear that same thing in the blue. I think it's right around here. So this is the new softer mix. And here's the hotter original mix. See how it's a little more intense in the hotter mix? It's brighter, it's hotter, okay? And that's the subtle thing we're trying to get to. I mean, you may think, I don't hear a big difference. Why do people try to master really loud anyway? Again, I always go back to what I've said in earlier videos. If you DJ, if you actually mix your songs with other producers' songs and you run them through a set and you're trying to do transitions and make it sound like it's all one long cohesive experience, trust me, if you're not quite as hot and dense, if you don't have quite those sharp edges to things and brightness and hotness and a little bit of distortion that's like too much distortion, really, to the seasoned audiophile ear, if you're not up in that same ballpark with that density and bite and hotness, your track's going to sound wimpy. It's going to sound like the energy dropped, even though it's normalized to the same volume in your DJ software. Okay, so this is why we're all stupidly, I think, forced to play in this loudness war in the bass music world, in the DJ world, in the club world, in the festival world. Now, techno can be a little more mellow. Other genres that you hear in smaller clubs and stuff can be a little more mellow, but the big festival-oriented stuff is just ridiculously hot. It's just the way the genre is. And if you're not doing it, you're not gonna sound right. If the DJ tries to turn up the treble or the mid-range or something to make you just as hot during the transition, you're going to be pegging out the meters and hitting the limiter at the front of the house, and everything goes weird. So loudness is important, and even these subtle differences can be really important, right? So at any rate, I believe I've talked about everything I wanted to talk about. I want to thank you so much for hanging with me. Feel free to ask questions on my YouTube, comment stream, and I'll try and answer if it's not ridiculously hard to answer. And I hope this has been helpful. I am finding this technique super easy. I know it's a little bit of weird, like, concepts you've never heard from anyone else on YouTube. I'm sure other producers do this to some level, whether they consciously realize what they're doing or not. I'm sure other people do this. I've never seen anyone talk about it on YouTube. I think I'm one of the first people to really lay it out, spell it out, take you on a deep dive, talk my way around it, show you all these demos. It's an easy process once you wrap your head around it. It really is. Set your anchor sounds, clip to 0, clip everything to 0, control your relative mix with the faders. And if you think before you start about, I'm making a big banger for festivals, I want to hit at least 7 LUFs, you can test that right up front, really quickly with just your anchor sounds and nothing else. Make sure that those sounds are hitting roughly around 7 LUFs with some dirty limiting on that final bus. And you can tell, all right, my kick and snare are good. They're going to work. They're not going to fall apart too much, because I know as I start pushing other sounds into this mix, I'm going to be dropping that dirty limiter, and they're going to be back to where I set them originally on their individual tracks, like that point where they just started breaking. I know they're going to get back to that as I fill out the mix. And then everything else as you go is just like bring in a new sound, set the clip to 0 on it, find its maximum potential loudness, see if it'll even fit in that mix, because your mix is going to be really freaking loud the whole way. And you're going to be working with these dirty clippers and limiters all over your project. But it's okay, because it's still really close to what the final result is going to look like. And it's still really clean if you do it right. And you can set every sound exactly where it needs to be. And so by the time you get to mastering and mixing, there's no surprises. Everything's already running hot. Everything's balanced and working together, hot. And all you're really doing at the end, there is one more thing I want to show you. All you're really doing at the end is trading off the dirty limiting for the cleaner final mastering style of limiting. And so that is the one thing I almost forgot to say it again. So let's talk about this real quick. I'm going to go back to the mixer. So we've got this, we've eventually rolled off all the clipping, the dirty clipping on our pre-master, right? And we're just already hitting our nice loudness target. And let's make sure metric AB is off. Let's just turn it off entirely. Okay, so we're kind of back to where we started. Kick, snare, synths, and we're hitting, let's go ahead and do the dirty limiting again. I think we were set it at about 2.2, 2.8. Let's try 2.8. I relaxed the kick and the snare, didn't I? Yep, let's turn those clippers back on. One more time. Okay, so we're hitting around -7.5 on the master with the mastering compressor and limiter off. We're using a dirty limiter, the card clipper on my final bus that pushes over to the master, right? My pre-master is the final bus. These are just utility buses. Don't worry about those. So I'm clipping 2.8. That's a dirty push into the ceiling to hit my target loudness. And I've been working this way the whole time, hearing this mix this way the whole time. Now, here's the thing to notice. Although I'm hitting negative 7.5 lefts, I'm also peaking over 0 true peak. And this is where we get back to some of my earlier videos where I said so many artists don't care about true peak. So many producers don't care about true peak. Mastering engineers know about it, they care about it, but their clients tell them not to. The record companies, the A&R reps will tell the mastering engineer, we don't care about true peak. Make it as loud as everything else out there. Make it as loud as the people we're competing this artist against, right? And so the mastering engineers, much to their reluctance, they ignore true peak. And that's why you'll pull down reference masters from Beatport or whatever. You'll look at the wave files, the original non-lossy wave files, and you'll see that a lot of festival-oriented music artists and pop artists peak way the hell over 0 in true peak. All they care about is not going over 0 sample peak. So again, if I switch to RMS mode, let's look at the sample peak. This is all anyone cares about for the most part, right? They go to 0 sample peak. They do not care that true peak is going way the hell over 0. They don't care about that. But there is some logic to the notion that you shouldn't push true peak over some ceiling. Now, if you're listening to the original lossless wave file, well, you want a true peak ceiling of 0 dB true peak, because then nothing's clipping, right? None of those peaks are clipping. But as this stands right now, as this file stands right now, if I burn this to a master and I play it back through my speakers, I'm going to be hearing every peak that went over 0 true peak is on my analog AD converters and stuff. It's going to be clipping, and I'm going to hear some clipping. Now, it's going to be very light. It doesn't happen very often, hopefully. It's just a few peaks here and there, so it might be buried in the mix, especially if it's a loud, hot mix to begin with. You may not even notice this, but technically it's there. And it gets even worse when you upload this song to any kind of streaming platform that compresses it to a lossless format. The general rule of thumb, all the mastering engineers recognize, is that if you're going to be uploading things to Spotify, YouTube, Tidal, Apple Music, even SoundCloud, right? Anything like that, any streaming platform, they always transcode you down to an MP3 or some other similar lossy kind of format. And the general understood, inarguable rule of thumb is if you don't want clipping, even in the lossy transcoded version, you need to start with a true peak of -1. You need to master everything to a true peak of -1. Now, I'm going to leave it up to you whether or not to follow that advice, but technically, if your true peak on your master and your DAW is louder than -1, technically you're going to have clipping by the time that ends up on Spotify or whatever. Okay? Maybe nobody will hear it. A lot of people bet that users don't care and won't hear it and won't notice the difference. But if you care about that, think about that. So again, in this artificial example, I mastered everything to -1 true peak and still hit -7.3 lefts. So let's talk about how that happens, because I'm using a dirty clipper. I'm hitting my target loudness, but I'm way over true peak. So this is where your mastering limiter comes in, because your mastering limiter can help you keep the true peak where it is and still push loud enough to hit your loudness target. So the first thing I'm going to do is basically take off all this gain, all the dirty limiting I'm doing on the pre-master. It's time to do final mastering. So we remove the dirty limiter. We take it back to neutral on the pre-master. That's number one. Now if I play this, it's going to be a lot quieter. It's quieter. It's still peaking over 0, right? So let's fix all that. First thing we want to do, you'll notice I didn't say anything about this going into the red, but still seeing 0. What this means is the signal that's coming into my master is hitting somewhere between 0 and 0.1. So it makes this little positive sign. It says it's not quite over the halfway point. So we're still going to call it 0, but we're going to make it red to show you that technically you're going over 0 on the sample peak. So all I'm going to do is go over here on my final summing bus, and I'm just going to drop this down a tiny bit on the fader. Let's do negative 0.03, right? Tiny, tiny amount downward. It still says 0, but it's a negative 0 now. And now let's see if this is still hitting in the red. Okay, so now it's really close to 0. It's just under 0. That's why it says negative. It's not perfectly on 0. Who cares? It's close enough. So now I go to the gain 0 and I make sure this one says I'm hitting 0. Okay, for all intents and purposes, the signal coming into the master is at peak, right? Now I'm going to turn on my mastering compressor. Let's actually turn it on. And rather deactivate it, bring it back into memory and reinstantiate it, and then turn it on. Okay, so I'm not going to show you these again. I showed them to you in the last video, but the point is now I have these guys applied. And if I look at my true peak now and my integrated loudness, watch what happens. And I feel like I changed one thing from my original. It still says 0.9. Look at this one. Did I actually turn on the right clippers again? Gain 0 is gain 0. Oh, I know what I did. Remember when we did our little exercise of turning everything down? Let's turn those back up again. This goes back to -6. This one goes back to 0. This one goes back to 0. Okay, now everything's running hot again where it was. So now, let's watch this one again. Okay, so what this is showing you is that at the very end, when I go into final mastering, I'm trading my dirty limiter, done quick and dirty with a simple hard clip that doesn't take any system resources. Still sounds good, still sounds close to a limiter, but I basically back it off and make it neutral again. And then I do my clean limiting. A little bit of mastering compressor to like prep the signal for the limiter and sharpen some things up and open some things up. And then the final limiter, which is set to do true peak limiting and is set to a ceiling of -1 decibels true peak. And then I had to push more than 2.8 on my dirty limiter. I had to push harder because I'm trying to get to the same loudness again with a much lower ceiling than before. So I did have to push louder, but the mastering limiter can allow you to push louder and still stay really transparent, especially if you prep the signal going into it with a really good mastering compressor and you know what you're doing here. This is a whole different ball of wax. I don't know if I'm ever going to talk about this. There's lots of good YouTube videos out there that talk about mastering compression. Took me a long time to really wrap my head around it. I'll give you my only rule of thumb is use a bus compressor, like any SSLG clone, right? Whether it's the Waves SSLG bus compressor or whether it's the glue in Ableton is basically a model of the SSLG, whether it's the actual the glue, looks like this. That's what I used for a while here in Bitwig. Since we don't have the glue compressor in Bitwig, I brought in the original glue. This is the SSLG, all the same settings, and I would use this as my mastering compressor. The basic idea, though, is whatever mastering compressor you use, you want it to barely dance with a really light amount of ratio, and you want it to barely dip, barely dance to maybe -1-ish. maybe a little more, maybe a little less. On your loud trigger downbeats and backbeats, kicks and snares. So if we watch this and you set the threshold appropriately, and I like to use an attack time of about 25 to 30 milliseconds to carve those nice shapes in I talked about in the last video. And I also fully unlink, I don't stereo link it, I unlink everything. So watch what happens with these meters here. See how it mostly just dances downward with each kick and snare? That's what you want. Okay, so anyway, point is, you trade off your dirty limiting for a clean limiter, put on whatever amount of true peak limiting you want, push maybe a little harder if you're applying true peak limiting, and just get yourself right back up to the same loudness range you were working at the whole time. But now you can also control the true peak. And I'm fairly confident that this will survive transcoding to a lossy format for the streaming platforms. And technically, I won't be peaking, even though this is a loud song and all that peaking would be hidden anyway. All that clipping would be hidden. So there you go. That's everything. If you're still stuck after all this, probably just need more practice and watch this video over a few times and just make notes and digest things. But if you can really wrap your head around this concept and this workflow, I guarantee you everything's going to go faster, especially if you work in loud genres. You're going to be so much less surprised by weird, nasty crap at the end, because it's just all going to pop out right away the minute you bring in new sounds. Okay, thanks for hanging with me, and I'll see you next time.